So this is where we left off a week ago because we had an entire class devoted to the bibliography exercise, which is now due today, right? I guess, isn't that today? When did I say Monday? That's right, I gave you till Monday. Right, yeah. In class I announced it. That I decided to give you till Monday. Yeah, that's right. I'll grade them on the plane. I remember now. Thank you for reminding me. Right? Don't be embarrassed to do that here. People are like, oh my God, the professor changed his mind. Tell us when we screw up. Monday. Don't hesitate to ask me last minute questions, right? Yeah, I got a source. I don't know how to format it. I'm not being able to find anything on my artist, but don't wait until Monday, right? Because that doesn't give me a lot of opportunity to help. Okay? And if you want to get it in early just to get it off your back, more power to you. Okay? Okay. So we left off early Renaissance Italy, right? The Renaissance sort of comes through these different stages. We as historians, it's a big movement, lasts 250 years, and we tend to break it into sort of 3 or 4 different sections, right? The early being Giotto and Duccio, which aren't really there yet, right? So we call it Proto-Renaissance. And then it's interrupted by the Black Plague that killed all of Giotto's pupils, right? And really stopped that movement for about 50 years. It gets started again around 1400 in a period we tend to refer to as the early Renaissance. Things are really cooking now, but they haven't reached the pinnacle yet, right? So early Renaissance Italy is the 15th century, and we were looking a week ago at Masaccio and how artists in Italy break away from the international Gothic style in a way that's kind of different from Northern European artists, from Jan van Eyck and the people in the Low Countries, where the people in the Low Countries are very much interested in using oil paint to give us extraordinarily tiny details, all of which are symbolic, right? The Arnolfini portrait with oranges and the chandelier and, the bed and everything, or the Annunciation in the National Gallery, right? Where every element seems to have symbolic content. For the Italians, the break with the international Gothic style is through this use of rational, ordered space. Right? Everything's become sort of perfectly rational. And perspective, right? Linear perspective is a huge part of that. That rationally ordered space. Right? And with that comes an interest in sort of poise and grace and sort of perfect ideal harmony, which is a hallmark of Italian Renaissance art and very different from what we saw in Northern art of the same time period. So we'll see more of this as it develops through the course of the 15th century. So Fra Angelico is a Dominican monk living at the monastery of San Marco. By the way, it's in the news this week. They're closing it. The last monks living in the Dominican monastery of San Marco, they're being moved across town and they're going to close it down. Already they've given up the half with the frescoes in it to a museum, right? So if you go to Florence, you don't have to bother the monks to see the Fra Angelicos, right? But the other half is being permanently shuttered. They're being sent to Santa Maria Novella, the other Dominican monastery in town, across town, right? It opened during Fra Angelico's time there, 1435-38. They got the land for it and built the monastery. And just this week, the last monks are moving out. Right? So interesting that that's in the news as we speak. Fra Angelico was a monk there and had been a painter before he took his vows, ended up being employed by the monastery to decorate significant portions of it with frescoes, which of course makes sense, right? Why hire somebody from outside if you got somebody here's willing to do it for free, and he's good, right? So you've got that going for you. So the Annunciation on the right is at the top of the stairs that lead us up to the rooms that the monks had where they lived, which were centered around a cloister. And that's kind of where we are on the left, is we're moving just past Fra Angelico's pictures kind of over our right shoulder here. And this is the walkway then that leads us to the monastic cells around a cloister, just like we saw in Dijon, right, at the Chartreuse de Champmont. And there's an inscription at the bottom that says, be careful when you pass in front of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Be careful that you don't forget to say, Hail Mary, as you're coming by, right? And you can see that what Fra Angelico has done is he's taken the monastery's own architecture as the basis for the setting of his Annunciation. So it looks almost like it's actually happening in the place that we are visiting, or if we live here, the place where we live. It's brought it to the contemporary world. It's made it relevant to us. And he uses symbolism in a very different way. There's not chock full of little details, each of which adds up to a sort of symbolic program. But there is this idea of the virginity of Mary as being a central theme to this image. Not only do we have the light coming through the window in the background, that age-old metaphor for the virgin birth, right? Directly next to her head. But we also have this sort of clean environment, a patio and a room in the back that are empty of almost everything except for the Virgin Mary. And that idea of empty rooms, clean patios, are metaphors for the virginity of Mary. As is the idea of a garden that is walled off from the wild woods outside. Right? The enclosed garden is something that we can find in medieval devotional literature, right? Things that were read by people doing their prayers throughout the Middle Ages. The Virgin as the enclosed garden. And so Fra Angelico has brought all of those different ideas together into this Annunciation. It's still very, very symbolic. It just doesn't sort of, it's not jam-packed like Robert Campans is, right? With every nook and cranny and detail of, the snuffed candle, the Trinity lilies, Jesus flying through the window, right? The reference to the communion. It doesn't have all those little things going on. It's much more simplified, but at the same time, equally symbolic, equally deeply poignant, right? So Fra Angelico was hired by his own monastery to paint a number of works for the monastery. The Annunciation is just one of them, right? There were frescoes in each of the monks' rooms by Fra Angelico as well. And he was hired to paint the altar piece, the painting that decorated the altar in the chapel at San Marco. And this is the altar piece, right, by Fra Angelico. You can see the woods in the background look very similar to the ones in the background of the Annunciation, right, with the golden sky behind them, almost as if it's a continuation of the same space. And here we have an old school composition, old school subject matter, the Virgin enthroned surrounded by saints. Giotto did it. Duccio did it, right? This is the traditional subject matter for an Italian altarpiece. Jesus looks directly at us on her knee. I'm sorry I couldn't get a really good picture of this. This is as good as I could find. I think it's in pretty bad shape, actually. There's a curtain draped behind her, cloth of honor, if you will. There are tiles in the floor. And she's surrounded by angels on either side immediately. And then in the foreground, 6 saints and 2 more, making 8 total, kneeling in the front. The 3 on the right with black robes and white underneath, they are dressed as Dominicans. Those are Dominican saints, right? And this is a Dominican monastery. We can identify each one of them. I'm not really going to go into them in any great detail except for the 2 in the front, who have the most prominent position, right? And you'll notice that one looks out at us and the other one looks back in. This is kind of interesting because the guy that published the theory on perspective, Alberti, took Brunelleschi's idea, sort of published it. This book was a guidebook to artists on how to make good paintings, right? And perspective was part of that. The other thing he said is that a painting should try to, you as the painter should try to make your paintings engage the viewer. And one of the tricks, he said, put figures on either side, have one of them look out, and have the other one look in. And so this is a great trick for sort of reaching out, grabbing you, and sort of telling you what to do. It grabs you and that's exactly what Fra Angelico is doing here, right? So who are these two saints in the foreground? Who are the ones that have more prominent position than any of the other saints? They are two brothers who were doctors around the 4th century, 3rd or 4th century AD, right? Saints Cosmas and Damian. And we know they're Saints Cosmas and Damian because you see their halos have their names on them, right? See it around the outside of his red hat? And Cosmas looks out at us. This is Cosmas. And Damian looks in, and Damian's taken off his hat in reverence, right? But they're dressed the same, and that's Fra Angelico's way of telling us that they're brothers, right? They're dressed the same, right? So they were two brothers who were doctors, and they were saints, right? And they were sainted because they had received the power from God to heal by touch. What a great thing for a doctor, right? You never screw up a prognosis that way. It's like, oh, come to me. Bing, right? Cosmas and Damian were physicians who could miraculously heal, okay? The face of Cosmas is the face of the head of the Medici family. The Medici family, we haven't talked about them yet, have we? The Medici family? Okay. The Medici family were, this can take a little bit of explanation. Florence as a city was governed by ostensibly a democracy of sorts, right? So they're very different than other cities where there might be an old school duke, like the Duke of Burgundy or something like that, right? And there was the most prominent families. It wasn't open democracy; it was an oligarchy. Right? So the most prominent families could be elected to office, but only for a fixed term. Right? It was a republic. And it's sort of modeled on the old Roman republic prior to the emperors, where there would be a council that would advise the rulers, but the rulers had fixed terms. And that way you couldn't become a dictator. Okay? That was the Florentine way of government, the city of Florence. Okay. The Medici family, beginning with Cosimo's dad, but really culminating under Cosimo de' Medici in the 1420s, 1430s, up until his death in the 1460s. The Medici family were the most powerful family in Florence. There was a special on them on PBS, no less, that called them the godfathers of the Renaissance. They were able to amass a significant amount of wealth and power. Now remember we said that Paolo Strozzi was the sort of the wealthiest man. They were more powerful. And in fact, at one point, Cosimo de' Medici got Paolo Strozzi kicked out of Florence, right? But the Medici family never held elective office because they realized they could get more power by getting their pawns, their puppets, elected to office. So it would not look like one family was governing everything on the face of things, right? That you could elect somebody different for these different terms, but they're all Medici puppets, right? So Cosimo de' Medici is the head of the Medici family, right? And his face is this face, Cosimo, right? Because Cosimo, this is his namesake, right? He was named after Saint Cosmos. Jason.
I was just going to ask, because you said that none of them had an elected office, but didn't a few Medicis become a pope?
That's much, much later, 100 years later. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
The Medici family, what happened, it's a really fascinating story. It would take forever to sort of go through it all. But yes, by 1527 or so, one of the Medicis becomes the pope. That's right. At this point, Cosimo, right, is working behind the scenes. And this is a memorial medallion that was made about 20 years later, maybe 30 years later, just after he died. Right? It's not like this big, done in the National Gallery. Okay? Cosimo, the people of Florence were okay with this at first until they kind of caught on. And so in 1433, they had Cosimo kicked out of Florence for a year, go do penance and come back, and we'll get Florence back to our roots of being a democracy, right, a republic. And when he came back, he was able to assemble even more power, and that's when he got Paolo Strozzi kicked out. right? In fact, when he got Paul Strozzi kicked out of Florence, he basically, what do you want to call it? He took all of Paul Strozzi's works of art and made them his own, right? It was sort of, they're mine now, right? And Paul Strozzi was not ever allowed to come back, right, in 1434. In 1482, his grandson, Lorenzo, who they called Lorenzo the Magnificent, was also kicked out of town, right? And was eventually the Medici family. There was a big uprising against them led by a religious fanatic named Savonarola, right around 1500, that said, hey, all of this wealth, right, is bad. We should be trying to live more pure lives, and money's getting in the way, right? And had the Medici kicked out then as well, right? So it's a long and sort of sordid story. But really, through the course of most of the 15th century, the city of Florence is ruled from behind the scenes by the Medici family, okay? Two things about them. One, they're bankers, okay? So they are making all their money off of usury, as we talked about before with the Arena Chapel, right? They're making their money off of interest on loans and whatnot, okay? But, maybe you can tell this by the name, the family wasn't always in the banking business. That if we trace the family roots back, the original members of the family were doctors, medicine, Medici, right? So Cosimo is named after the doctor saint as part of that legacy. And his brother was named Damiano, named after Damien, right? So he's the one, from his wealth in 1438, gives the money to the Dominicans to build San Marco, because he just gotten the land, right, to build the second monastery in town. He gives the money to build a monastery, and the motivation is exactly the same motivation as Enrico Scrivagni at the Arena Chapel, or Duke Philip the Bold of Burgundy in Dijon, right? It's a good work, all right? It's a place for you to pray. It's a place for people to pray for you, right? That was Cosimo's motivation. And for giving the money not only for the monastery building, right? By the way, the architect was the same architect that built his palace, right? So he kind of loans his artists as well. He gives money for the building. He pays for the works of art. He gets his picture included praying to the Virgin Mary, right? Via his namesake. The fascinating thing is Damiano, his brother, had recently died. And we think that's why his back is turned. And in fact, he holds in his hand with his hat a little palm branch. Can you see it there? It looks like a feather. Just by my little box, right, just here. And that's a palm branch is a symbol of martyrdom, of death. So he is now passed away and memorialized in this image as well. Okay? Keep in mind, we're going to be talking a lot about the Medici, especially about Cosimo at this point, because this is now, by the 1430s, Paolo Strozzi is out of the picture, right? And kicked out of Florence by this guy. And they are now ostensibly the most powerful people in the entire city, right? Governing from behind the scenes. Now, there was a predella, we've talked about predellas before, this series of narrative pictures underneath the main image of the Virgin enthroned in heaven. And there were something like 7 scenes. We think it wrapped around the sides, right? It was like three-dimensional, came out from the wall. And the National Gallery has one of them, right? So the one in blue here, which was on sort of on the edge of it, on the sides, these 7 images tell us the story of Cosmas and Damien. Like it's a great legend. It's really kind of fun, right? And this is told through the Golden Legend, which has come up on some of your worksheets as this sort of story of the saints, right? That was written in the 13th century. Tells us the story of Saints Cosmas and Damien, how they have received this miraculous power to heal. And so we see their story played out across these scenes on the bottom. And as the story goes, once they receive the power to heal through God, they took a vow with each other to never receive payment for their gift, right? It's one thing to be a doctor and charge somebody, for treatment if you had to go to school for it. But it's another thing if you're doing it as a conduit of God's power. That would just be wrong. So they vow we will never take money for services, okay? Now, Palladia was a Roman, wealthy Roman woman, and she had gone to all of the doctors everywhere for medical treatment. And she, I believe, if I remember correctly, I think she had a gangrened leg or something like that. And she eventually decides, well, none of this is working. I heard about these guys. I'll call in the alternative medicine, right, as it were. So she goes to Cosmas and Damian, and lo and behold, of course, they can heal her, right? And so that's the scene we see inside this alcove, is Cosmas and Damian coming to Palladia, we're going to heal you, right? Look at the perspective, right? Again, we talked about how Italian artists use perspective to set the scene. The curtain hanging around her bed, that wonderful ewer, right? That pewter jug and vase, rendered in really good perspective, right? That's a hallmark of Italian art. And so there's Cosmas and Damian, again, dressed the same, right? And they are now going to heal old Palladia while her two servants look on from behind the bed, right? In the second half of the scene, we see, I think it's Cosmas again, receiving payment, going against his word to his brother. And the reason he does it is he's trying to be polite. He says, again, the Golden Legend tells us this. She offers him a gift. So you got to take something. You saved me. You've got to take something. No. No, please. No. And finally, okay, I'll take it. Just to make nice, right? And you can see from his gesture, he's kind of like, right, antsy about this whole thing. Well, his brother Damian finds out about it and swears that they will never work together again. You are dead to me, right? And that I don't even want to be buried next to you, right? They're so angry. And the story gets really fun after that, right? Because they get hauled before the Roman emperor, tortured, and he tries to have them martyred. And every time he tries to have them martyred, it backfires. So he ties them to a stake, and he gets a bunch of archers to shoot arrows at him. And all the arrows bounce off, and they kill the archers, right? And then he tries to have them burned at the stake, and for some reason the fire won't sort of climb up to the center, right? God. And then he says, okay, I'm going to tie him up, I'm going to throw him in the ocean. And the ocean spits them back out again. And so he finally cuts off their heads. And that always works, right? And then they're dead. And then the funny part is right before he cuts off their heads, a camel tells Damian, your brother did the right thing. Silly story. And he decides to be buried next to him. That's all told out across the bottom. We have the first one down at the National Gallery. So like our Duccio piece that we saw with the Nativity, this is kind of an important work, right? I mean, it came from a very prominent place, and we're very, very fortunate to have it. And we see told here in very human terms, again, this Italian interest in humanity, rational humanity, the story being told in two different scenes, right? And setting up the stage for the altarpiece, right? And again, focusing on Cosmas and Damian because it's sponsored by the Medici family, and in particular, Cosimo de' Medici. Right? Another artist who worked for Cosimo de' Medici is also a monk named Fra Filippo Lippi. We have a wonderful altarpiece by him down at the National Gallery. It might be a private work. It's just big enough that it could have been in public. It could have been in someone's home. Probably not for the Medici family. At least there's no proof. But certainly for someone to use in prayer. Now, we know from various accounts of the lives of artists in the 15th century that Fra Filippo Lippi spent a lot of time working for Cosimo de' Medici. In fact, he decorated a chapel in the Medici palace. We also know that unlike Fra Angelico, Fra Filippo Lippi was kind of, not particularly devout. As it turns out, he liked to party. And we were told this in the account of his biography, right? That he used to just love to go out drinking, hanging out. There's a record of him being tried for embezzlement of funds, right? He one time went off to a monastery in northern Italy to paint frescoes in a convent next to it. A nun in the convent got pregnant, right? Eventually got kicked out of the order. But he still signed his paintings Fra Filippo Lippi even after being kicked out, right? We're told also that when he was working for Cosimo de' Medici, that Cosimo would actually have to lock him up to get him to finish his projects because he would just as soon go out and play, right? So these are stories around Fra Filippo Lippi. He didn't end up living in a monastery his entire life, but he kept going by the name, right? Brother Filippo Lippi. Well, here we've got Madonna and Child. The guy who told us the story. One of the great sources for looking at Renaissance art is a set of biographies that was written in the 1560s by a man named Vasari, Giorgio Vasari. And what Vasari did, Vasari was a painter, studied under Michelangelo, the sculptor, right? You've heard of Michelangelo. Yeah? Mutant Ninja Turtle, all of that stuff. Vasari was one of his students, went off to be his own painter, right, on his own, but decided that he was going to write a history of art, one of the very first histories of art, about how the Renaissance developed. And he called it The Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. Right? It tells us a story of art from Giotto onward. Right? And it was all sort of, everything leads to Michelangelo, is kind of the way he wrote it. Right? And he's the one that gave us all these details about Fra Filippo Lippi's life. Right? Because he was born in Florence, he knew Florence, he studied there. It's a great resource for us when it comes to our knowledge of the lives of Renaissance artists. So this whole story about Filippo Lippi's randy behavior is thanks in large part to Giorgio Vasari. Now the work that we're looking at is a type of work that Filippo Lippi cranked out with some regularity. Another painting by him here, where you can see it's roughly the same idea, the same sort of setting. Jesus is now standing rather than seated, hugging mom, who knows, rather than spitting up or something. He does kind of look like he was gurgling there, right? But he'd worked these things rather regularly. And you'll notice as you look at the two of them that we've got this rather prominent and strange architectural setting. That within this marble framework, right, in both of them with inset marble panels and stone framing around, we have a half dome around the head of the Virgin Mary that looks like a shell, right? Like a conch shell directly around her head. It's a seashell. And that's kind of an interesting element that he would repeat that in these two, and it makes us wonder what's going on with the seashell. What would a seashell remind people of during the Renaissance? And one of the most obvious points of reference for that seashell is Venus. The goddess Venus, the Roman goddess of love, Venus, was by legend born at sea and washed ashore on a conch shell. Right? And that's what we see here in the famous work by Botticelli. You've probably seen this before somewhere. It's an oil of Olay ad, right? It was in movies all the time. You see it regularly. Well, people looking at Lippi's work would have been reminded through the seashell of Venus, drawn a connection between the Virgin Mary and Venus herself. And it kind of makes sense. Venus was born at sea. It's kind of an icky story, right? One god had his testicles cut off and they got thrown into the sea, and that's how she was born. Miraculous melding of heaven, right? Virgin Mary for Catholics, also born miraculously, Jesus the same way, right? God intermingling with natural matter to make both the Virgin and Jesus. So that makes sense to sort of connect them two, right? The Virgin Mary and Christ are about God's love for mankind. Venus is the goddess of love, right? There are similarities here, right? It's not blasphemous to connect the two. And in fact, in the 15th century, there was a branch of philosophy called Neoplatonism, sort of a new interest in the writings of Plato from the ancient Greek period, right? And I think this kind of comes up in one of the worksheets that's upcoming, right? But a new interest in Plato's writings, Neoplatonism. And in Florence in particular, Neoplatonism became very much interested in interconnections between different religions, between myths and Christianity, and became a sort of a mind game, if you will, that would look and tease out these different associations. Right? We'll talk a lot about Neoplatonism and aspects of it as we're looking at Renaissance art. Here we're seeing one. It was the Neoplatonists who drew a connection between Venus and the Virgin Mary, and would then tease out all of the ramifications of what that comparison meant. Right? So viewers looking at Filippo Lippi's work would have been reminded of Venus, but with symbolic reason, right? And been reminded of the Virgin's love for mankind, how she is, in many ways, a goddess of Christian love. There's also this sense that her head is kind of like a pearl almost inside that shell, which adds to her sense of beauty, of perfection, of virginity. And she's wearing that wonderful pearl on her forehead too, right? Just above where the robe comes together at the top of her forehead, there's a great, huge pearl as she looks out sort of languidly at us. Right? There are other symbolisms here as well. You notice Jesus is yanking at her finger again, just like we saw in Giotto. He might have known the Giotto. It's in town, right? It was in Florence. It's 100 years old, but it was in Florence at this point. And he may well have borrowed that from Giotto. But look, what is she doing with her hands? Right? She's sort of playing with his chin, right? But look at where her fingers are on his chin. What's between her thumb and her forefinger? Is what part of his throat, though? What does he have that you don't?
Oh, the Adam's apple.
Adam's apple, right? Right? And that's what she's touching is his Adam's apple. That, I think, is totally purposeful, right? In the Middle Ages, they believed that that men had the Adam's apple because when Adam ate the apple, it stuck, right? And that's why we've got it and you don't, right? Even though medieval Christians blame women anyway, right? That hasn't gone away. Anyway, she's looking at this part of Christ that reminds you of Adam. Why would you do that? Because there's a connection here, right? Adam brings sin. Christ heals it, right? He is sent to earth specifically because Adam screwed up, right? And when we read philosophers, theologians from the Middle Ages and Renaissance, they usually refer to to Christ as the new Adam. Right? Filippo Lippi is actually giving us a direct reference to that idea. Right? She's signifying why he's here in the first place, to help heal the sin of Adam. Yeah, Lenore.
So how does he heal the sin?
Well, this is Christian theology, okay? So Adam, in Christian theology, there's a better question better asked of the Bryans, right? Flanagan or Doyle. But I hope I don't screw it up too bad here. I'm not practicing anything. Adam's sin is inherited by all men. Eve's by all women, right? And we sort of talked about that with the thorny branch in the Giotto picture, okay? Right? And therefore, we are sinful by nature because of what Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden. This is the theological idea. right? The only way that we can remedy that for Christians, under Judaism, it was through the Ten Commandments. It was through the law. But for Christians, it's through the grace of God. And the only way that grace will be given to us, or was given to us, was by the sacrifice of Christ. And the only way that you can get it, according to theology, is to recognize that. Right? Accept him as your Lord and Savior. Okay? So it is through Christ's sacrifice, through his birth, his life, and his death, and your acknowledgement of that the sin of Adam is wiped clean from your life. Right? So you are healed from the sin of Adam. Does that make sense? But again, and we have to keep in mind that regardless of what we may believe here in the 21st century, from whatever religion you may be from, that's what they believed in the 15th century in Florence, where Filippo Lippi painted this. Right? That's what the audience would have brought to it. Did that clarify it? Yeah. These images of the Madonna and Child were incredibly popular in the 15th century. Many, many people were buying them, either for decorations in small chapels and churches or for private usage. There's a raft of these, and many artists were cranking out different variations on the theme. We already saw two by Fra Filippo Lippi. Botticelli, Sandro Botticelli, he did the Birth of Venus we just saw, right? He studied under Lippi, right? Lippi was his teacher. And at a very early age, we think this is one of his very earliest pictures. He's maybe 15, 16 years old when he painted this. He's still working very closely with Lippi, right, as a pupil. Because remember that in the Renaissance, the way that you learned art was not to go to college, but you would apprentice, and that's the way you learned any trade. It was directly through apprenticeship. And this work by Botticelli is really close to a Lippi. This is another Lippi. This was, I think, in London, right? And you can see that this picture is so similar, right? The overall composition, the look on the Virgin Mary's face, eyes downcast. We think that this one on the left, look at those wonderful pearls, but we think this is the nun because she ran off with him afterwards, right? She got kicked out of the convent. We think that's the one that he knocked up over here on the left. But there are angels now presenting Jesus up to the Virgin Mary. It's kind of cute, the one in the back who is almost all blocked there. And how Botticelli has basically the same idea, but he's moved that other angel out, right? So we can see him better. Yeah. So early on in his career, Botticelli, making other works, tapping into this market for images of the Madonna and Child, bases his work very much on Filippo Lippi. Right down to, see in the background, there's the conch shell again, right? Behind the figures in the background. We also think that's a self-portrait of Botticelli, right? That's about the age he was, a boy genius working under Lippi. And I don't really want to go into the evidence for this. It's out there. There's other pictures where we think there are self-portraits that were painted about 5 years later, and it looks like the same guy 5 years later, right? That doesn't mean it's not some pupil he had or somebody else that was around, a friend. But we think that maybe that this is a self-portrait. Now, this particular image, Botticelli's Madonna and Child, was actually made for the Medici family. This was a work that they had bought from him for their private use. And the reason we know it is that is the Medici coat of arms on the Virgin Mary's chair. Those 6 gold half domes in a circle, that's the Medici coat of arms, right? And it decorates her throne, so this is most certainly done for them, right? Again, probably for our old friend, Cosimo de' Medici, right, who we saw before. So we've looked at now a number of different works that are associated very, very closely with the Medici family, right? A work of art in the National Gallery that they probably owned, or most certainly owned, and all of the works at the Monastery of San Marco that they had paid for. This work from the National Gallery was probably also made for them. Right? There's an inventory of Medici works in the 1480s, and it lists a picture of these dimensions, a round picture that shows the Nativity. Right? This was another Medici painting commissioned by them. And it was worked on by two artists. It was worked on both of our brethren, right? Fra Angelico began the work on it, and Fra Filippo Lippi completed it. And we know the different artists by the different styles. The ones that look really angelic are Fra Angelico. Many of the others filled in by Filippo Lippi. And it shows us the exact same scene that we saw with the Strozzi altarpiece. This is where the Magi, the wise men, the kings, come to visit Jesus, having followed the star. Let's see my next, right? This kind of work in a round frame is called a tondo. That's the proper word for this, a tondo painting. And a tondo painting derives from the tradition of giving gifts at the birth of an infant. In Italy, when children were born, it was customary for families to come visit, especially with wealthier families, to come visit the newborn child and bring him gifts, sort of like the Magi, right? Come and bring them gifts. And it became customary in the 14th, early part of the 15th century, the best gift you could bring, or the customary traditional gift, was to bring a silver platter as a gift, right? A round silver platter. And this morphed in the course of the 15th century to giving instead a round painting as a gift. So we think that this may well have been a gift to the Medici family, based on the fact that it uses the tondo format. And the idea of a gift of a birth being commemorated with a round painting, the subject matter that Angelico and Lippi choose, the birth of Christ, is a good subject matter for that, right? A birth for a birth. Just as the Magi brought their gifts to Jesus, here, I've got this for you, right? And for the Medici, this is huge, by the way, right? It's a good, 5 feet, right, in diameter. It's pretty massive. And it would make, obviously, a very, it would be a very special gift for somebody as powerful as the Medici family, right? So we have in the foreground the retinue, right, the whole group of the Magi coming together and working their way in as they come now to greet Christ. We see this throng of people, much more realistic than what we saw with Gentili da Fabriano as they push their way forward. And the different kings now bringing their gifts, all of them kneeling in the foreground in blue and red and then also in pink, as the oldest one is right in front. And there we see the eldest Magus, right, the eldest king, doing that thing again where he's reaching out to grab Jesus' foot to kiss it, as a reference, of course, to the communion, right? We talked about that before. Jesus blessing him. We think that this entire group in the center here is Fra Angelico. The Virgin Mary just looks totally like his other Virgin Marys, right? There's the ox and the donkey in the background, typical for nativity scenes that we've seen before. We have references to warfare that we've seen before. We have references to the exotic origin of the Magi with the camel. 2 birds, a bird of prey attacking a peacock, right? That's again the trouble in the world that Adam had brought, that Jesus is born to help solve, right? Which we were just talking about. And here it looks almost like they're posed on top of the tree, and we certainly have a larger peacock off to the left as these 2 birds fight. There are strange details as well, like these half-naked men hanging out by the ruins of the city wall that the Magi have come through. We think that the whole idea of the ruins is exactly what we saw in Jan van Eyck when we looked at the ruined church where the Annunciation takes place. The idea that Christ is here to fix things. That's the Christian theology, right? He's here to fix things, to rebuild. And so these ruins in the background may be that idea of rebuilding. And perhaps these naked people, you see the one kneeling on the ruins is utterly naked, right? Doesn't even have a loincloth or a drape around him, that they're meant to be sort of sinful men, needing Christ's salvation, needing something to cover them, if you will. In the foreground, down on the ground in front of them, we have our horses not particularly friendly with each other, right? Starting to sniff at each other and stamp their hoofs. Again, something we've seen in works before. And we also have behind Joseph, who plays a much more proactive role than anyone that we've seen so far. We have another of our shepherds coming into worship as well, with his torn trousers, just like we saw in Duccio's work at the very beginning of class. Right. We'll end with one more quick comparison, because I think this is kind of fascinating. I've never seen this in the literature discussed anywhere. Nobody, I don't think anybody's written about this. But when we talked about Cosimo de' Medici, one of the things we talked about was the fact that he got Paolo Strozzi kicked out of town, right? And in 1434, okay? And this is just as the Medici are now sort of ascending to the height of their power, okay? Cosimo was kicked out for a year by a group of people that Paolo Strozzi was part of. And they wanted him kicked out just because he was violating the charter of the city, which was all about Republican elective government. When he comes back, he gets Paolo Strozzi kicked out for life. He then usurps, right, all of Paolo Strozzi's art, makes it part of his own collection. That means the Strozzi altarpiece became Cosimo de' Medici's altarpiece, right? He owns it after 1434, even though when it was commissioned it belonged to Paolo Strozzi. So by the time Angelico and Lippi are painting this thing, this is in, the Gentili work is in Cosimo's collection. So whoever commissioned this, it may have been the Medici family themselves, we don't know, right? Are seen to be, I think, making reference to that work. Because both of them have exactly the same theme. The Magi coming forward, curling around, right, to Joseph and the Virgin. Instead of the midwives, we get a shepherd behind them. Instead of that sequencing of standing, kneeling, and down on your knees, right, we have them all gathered together. But it's kind of a take on this idea. We get the camels, we get the fighting horses, we get the fighting birds. All sort of redone in a newer style to fit with Cosimo's other works. Right? I think this is totally there. And then the other thing that's always struck me is if we look closely, right? Remember these guys? Look at that guy over there. Right? And you realize that there's these little visual quotes that suggest that Angelico and Lippi are looking back at this work, right? Are aware of it, and are incorporating elements of it into their work to make it sort of part of the Medici collection, right? To make it more attractive to Cosimo de' Medici. Yeah. That's where we'll quit for today. On Monday, we'll wrap up 15th century Italian. We'll move into the High Renaissance. I don't know when I'm going to have a chance to record those other lectures. This weekend, maybe. I'm supposed to do reviews of my faculty for the dean this weekend before I take off. We'll see. I'm hoping at least one, maybe two of them recorded this weekend and get them up there so that we can be working on that while I'm away. Okay? And Monday, remember your bibliographies, right? And I'll get those back to you with time to revise them, given that, remember that the final grade will be for the revised version. Okay? And if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask me, but please don't wait until the very, very last minute.